Hi everyone, welcome to the Debate Hotline Nocember Public Forum topic lecture. So the topic for Nocember is resolve the United States federal government should require technology companies to provide lawful access to encrypted communications. So there's a lot to unpack in this resolution, so let's go through each term. So first of all, these are a couple of key definitions. So as shown in the resolution here, it references technology companies, and this just refers to any company that has end-to-end encrypted communications, which means that just data is produced at one end and then received at the other end. So for example, there's a ton of companies you probably know and probably use every day that are technology companies. For example, Apple is a technology company. Any social media website, for example, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. These are all technology companies that have encrypted communications. Now, what I mean by data being produced at one end and received at the other, this is a private data, and this is privately produced at one end and received at another. So this means, for example, direct messaging, like texting your mom, things like that, where it's only sent by one person and only received by a singular other person too, right? So for example, someone on Instagram publishing a post that is public, that is not encrypted communications, and that data is produced at one end, but it's received at various other ends. So that wouldn't really count. Instead, we would refer to encrypted communications being like direct messages, things like that. There are also other types of encrypted communications. For example, satellites are considered one because the government sends data directly to the satellite and it's only received at that one end. So it is technically encrypted communications in that regard. So the second term is lawful access. So there's two possible implementations of lawful access, and we'll discuss what this means more in the next slide, but this will be a pretty big topic and pretty big part of your debates because this is what the AF is advocating for. So they have to explain which implementation is the most probable and why. And there's a couple reasons for both, and a couple advantages and disadvantages for both as well. So the last thing is, what does encrypted communications means? So anything that's encrypted just means that the data is converted into ones and zeros in their coding, which prevents third parties from intercepting. It's a lot more difficult for a third-party hacker or a third party to understand the data when it is converted, because it's just a lot more difficult to understand compared to other types of coding that is more simple to understand and more simple to digest. So for example, this creates a higher degree of confidentiality. So in order to make sure that people that want to read the data, that are allowed to read the data and supposed to, they have something called encryption keys that are used to convert the encrypted data from encrypted data to non-encrypted data. So it goes from unreadable data to readable data. I know that the slide shows that it goes from readable data to unreadable, but it's supposed to be the opposite. Encryption keys really go both ways. It's like locking a door. You can unlock it or keep locking it, so it goes back and forth. You can decode it or you can recode it, things like that, to make it more difficult to see. But essentially, an encryption key is just to make it more easy to understand and read the information. However, encryption keys can also be dangerous because since there's a key, it's a lot easier for the hacker to get involved or get a hold of this key and then intercept the information or hack the information or read the information, which they are not supposed to. For example, it's a lot easier to take down, or it's a lot more difficult to take down the entire door rather than just get the key to the door and unlock it that way. Okay. So talking about lawful access, there's two types. There's front door and backdoor access. Front door access just means that there are specific access points that are known between both the company and government that are agreed upon. Now, this might sound logical, but there's a distinction between that backdoor. So front door access just means that it's more above the table. The company and the government both have to agree, and they're both aware of it. So this can happen in a couple key ways. Front door access can manifest in split key, which is, if you guys remember the encryption keys we just talked about, half the encryption key would belong to the company and half the encryption key would belong to the government, so that every time the government would want to access onto a server, they would have to ask the company for the other half of the encryption key. That way the company is more aware of when the government wants the information and what information the government wants. Second thing that they could be is biometric login. So the government has to get a biometric login from the company, which means they just have to go through a high process, and like same thing with authentication. So this just makes it a little bit more of a higher level for the government to get access. It makes it a little bit more difficult, but it does make it more safe because it's since there's a higher level of entry, it also is a high level of entry for hackers. It makes hacking less easy, and it also allows for more cooperation. However, this could also lead to tension and conflict between companies and governments because they have different wants, they have different needs, and sometimes they might not always agree, which means that this could create wait times. This could be potentially poor for time frame weighing. It can make your solvency a little bit longer based on whether the company and government agree to actually solve for your impact. But things like that, it's important to know what type of access there is. The second type of access is backdoor access. This just means that the government has free access to a server whenever they want. And this is considered the more probable implementation because it's easier and it's used in most arguments, especially on the neg. This is where a lot of the disadvantages come into place. For example, it's a lot easier to hack, but it also is a lot easier for the government to access any data, so the solvency is faster, the time frame is there. There's pros and cons to both types of access. However, you just have to argue for which is the most probable implementation. There have been rejections of both front and backdoor access before, so it's really fair game to argue during the round which access you think is more probable. Okay, so let's move on to some arguments. So the first argument, and something that's really common you're going to see, is trafficking. So the argument is essentially that currently trafficking is being enabled using encrypted communications, and this can be through a couple different ways. So some of the warrants are, being in closer proximity, being able to communicate with others, and being able to recruit others more easily. There's also a couple more, but essentially, if you're able to connect with someone really easily and privately, it's a lot easier to recruit them for trafficking or indoctrinate them or manipulate them, things like that. And trafficking can manifest in a couple different ways. So you can have human trafficking, you can have sex trafficking, or you can have drug trafficking. And these are all different types of trafficking that are being enabled and pushed through encrypted communication. So specifically, human trafficking can be used for just, traffickers to communicate with each other, for traffickers to target and find victims, things like that. Similar with sex trafficking, drug trafficking can just be used to connect, buyers and sellers, traffickers, things like that. So the link is that lawful encryption aids in capturing traffickers. So this can happen in two ways. One of them is locating and finding new traffickers, but the second is also using the encrypted communications, so all of their texts and things like that, as evidence to actually prosecute already suspicious people. So it not only helps locate new traffickers, but also help prosecute old traffickers and ensure that they won't be able to traffic anymore. This also potentially has a perceptual link where if traffickers know that they're more easily found, then they're going to stop trafficking as much. So there's a perceptual link as well. And the impact is just that trafficking is really bad. It impacts millions of people across the world. Obviously, human trafficking, sex trafficking, drug trafficking all have incredibly terrible impacts that are incredibly bad to so many marginalized communities and large communities. And overall, they're really bad. But you should just make sure that your impact is dependent specifically on the trafficking type that you decide to focus on. I think a pretty strategic choice would be to have trafficking as an overall contention, and there's have sub points on that. But ultimately, it's up to you and whether you think which argument you like to advocate for the best. The second argument is terrorism. This is really similar to trafficking, and the link chain is almost identical, but just replaced with terrorism. So currently, terrorism is being enabled using encrypted communications, and we have the same warrants as trafficking. So being in closer proximity, being able to recruit, being able to communicate more easily, all these things, and being private are really useful and a big factor in why terrorism is going up. And terrorism here can refer to both domestic and international terrorism. So, for example, polarization within political parties domestically, or internationally, you can have terrorists that are more focused on recruiting people within the US or within other countries, things like that. So lawful encryption aids in locating the intel in order to stop terrorism, which means that we can stop terrorism before it occurs, before any launches are happening. And also perceptually, it stops terrorists from recruiting other people or communicating as openly about terrorism. Terrorism links to a lot of impacts, but one of the big ones is global hegemony, especially if it's international terrorism. This is because as a hegemony, the US should be powerful and should have a lot of soft power, but if they're getting heavily impacted by international terror or even domestic terror, this can make us look really weak. It can make us look bad to our allies, and this can affect our global hegemony. Not only that, terrorism can just link to any terror impact. So, for example, bioterror, regular terror, nuclear weapons being used, things like that are all impacts that come out of terrorism. You just have to have the right evidence. But a lot of these things are pretty common arguments that you'll see. And you'll probably find a lot of evidence on this regardless. Okay, our next argument is cyber attacks. So this is pretty similar, same idea. So cyber attacks are increasing, especially on encrypted communications, and this can either be domestic cyber attacks or international cyber attacks. So from a country like Russia or China or any other opponent or country that the US is against. So lawful access perpetually or perceptually deters cyber attacks from happening, because of the idea that the government is supporting and constantly surveilling means that a lot of cyber attacks are too scared to attack, or other countries don't want to have a full-blown out war, so they're perceptually deterred. You can also spike out any hacking increases blocks, so the responses that your opponents make that any lawful access creates more hacking and directly turns this argument. And you can block or you can spike this out by explaining that lawful access, in this case, would be implemented as split key, so front door access, which makes it more difficult to hack because they just can't get into the servers as easily and the government is surveilling. So there's an extra layer of surveillance. Cyber attacks are pretty bad for a couple reasons. Domestically, they can impact things like healthcare, they can worsen poverty, worsen the economy, overall just like worsen economic sectors and just have intelligence, which are pretty bad. Those are more of your lay impacts, your small stick impacts. But internationally, you could have nuclear war, conventional war, hegemony, technology could be hacked, things like that. Cyber attacks can lead to any of these impacts. Something to note is that cyber attacks are non-unique because they're happening right now. So you have to prove why more cyber attacks would uniquely lead to these scenarios, which could be something difficult to prove. But I think as long as you can prove that there's a bright line or a brink or something, there's still a try or die weighing that's possible there. Okay. Next, we have AI markets. So currently, the U.S. is manipulating AI markets through encrypted communications, and this is privately done because we're not able to track them. Lawful access holds companies accountable and prevents manipulation because it goes on the air. The government's able to surveil everything, which is really good because it prevents the AI bubble from bursting, which it is about to do like really, really soon, apparently, according to a lot of sources. The AI bubble bursting is really bad. It leads to recession. It can lead to nuclear conflict because AI is often conflated with high tensions capabilities, for example, the AI war capabilities, things like that. Also militarily. So AI is just really important in general. Let's move on to some neg arguments. So the first neg argument, and this is a pretty perceptual lay argument because there isn't really a true impact to this, but essentially access to encrypted communications means that governments can surveil us, which is pretty true. This can threaten to spill over into daily life, so it threatens democracy. This is just if the government's able to surveil every single part of your life, they're able to control almost every part of your life, and freedom of speech is something really big within America and a lot of Western democracies and Western countries. So if this threatens democracy in the US, this can threaten democracy worldwide, and democracy is an impact filter. Having our freedom of speech is also an impact filter. It's really important that we're able to speak out, things like that. Democracy is an impact filter because it's often democracies that are stopping authoritarians or poor or countries that with poor living conditions or poor human rights. The second argument is AI. So currently the US is winning the AI race against China, and your evidence on this should be very recent because this is pretty important to make sure that you're winning the uniqueness, because uniqueness here controls the link. Otherwise the argument is non-unique and your impact doesn't matter. So currently the US should be winning against China, but you just have to prove this by a margin. It doesn't have to be by a whole lot. In fact, I think it's better that it's a margin because it kind of creates a sense of urgency that you shouldn't, that like if you did affirm, the impact would trigger immediately because it's so close. But the link is that lawful access makes it easy for data to be stolen because of the backdoor argument, once again, like we've said, which means that other countries can catch up. Hackers can steal AI ideas, give it to China, things like that. It's just really bad, or it just sets the US behind and it makes it more difficult for us to win the AI race. There's also a perceptual link. So what happens when the possibility of hacking becomes prominent is that investors and US companies get scared of this possibility and they end up leaving countries or switching servers because they don't want to lose profit, right? At the end of the day, investors and companies are in it for money, and they're going to do what is most economical and most beneficial for them. And if that's leaving the country in order to pursue financial gains in other countries, then they will do so. And this happens almost immediately because it's a perceptual link. If they feel that they have fear, they're going to want to preempt the dangers by moving quickly. So this is really bad because when investors or companies leave, AI gets worse in the US. We're not able to control it as good as we can, and we end up losing the race. Losing the AI race is really bad because it leads to China dominance, and this can be economically and militarily. China is planning to use AI both in their economy and militarily, and they don't have as much of a moral framework as the US does, so they're not afraid of using AI in these ways compared to the US. A China hegemony or China, military advantage leads to a nuclear war, great power war, other powers are drawn in, it becomes like a power vacuum. All of these arguments are possible to be made. You can get to nuclear war really easily with any of these links. Okay. The next argument is cyber. So currently the US has good cyber defense, but backdoor access creates vulnerabilities to hacking. You can mention a specific country, for example, Russia cyber attacks, China cyber attacks, any other countries against cyber attacks eventually go nuclear or start a war that draws powers in. This is a pretty self-explanatory argument. I think it's somewhat true, but once again, this relies on the backdoor access being vulnerable, and this also relies on cyber attacks being unique to starting a war or going nuclear compared to previous cyber attacks. The next argument, and a really big one, I think that is very strategical to go for, is the economy. So the uniqueness is twofold. One, that the economy is doing well right now and we're moving in a positive direction. So you can say this in a couple different measurements. For example, employment being up, GDP increasing, inflation being down. There's a lot of different ways to measure how the economy is doing. You just have to do the holistic analysis and the explanation as to why your evidence is the best on that. And the second thing you have to explain is that the economy is doing well because of encryption, and that specifically the encryption market and technology market is growing rapidly. So it's estimated to be valued at 1.8 billion by 2032. I'm sure you can find other numbers that explain how encryption and technology are really important these days, but it's pretty self-explanatory. We're in more of a digital age, and there's probably a lot of evidence out there that supports this. So the AF ruins this with 3 warrants. The first is that US companies leave because they lose a competitive edge without privacy. What this means is that when the government has access to all their data and other companies do as well, it becomes a lot more difficult for them to have their competitive edge. Instead, sharing their intelligence and not being private means that they're just not able to compete as well. Companies want to make the most amount of profit. That's their goal in the long term. So they would rather go to other countries that have protective laws that would benefit them more rather than stay in the US. So these companies would leave. This would hurt the economy. Second, investors would also leave because they fear hacking. Once again, this is the perceptual link that we've mentioned in a couple different arguments. They fear hacking. They fear companies not doing as well. So they would also leave these companies and perhaps go abroad or just invest in something else. The last warrant is that having lawful access creates a lot of maintenance fees. For example, you have to have someone constantly surveilling that servers to make sure that there's no hacking. You have to it just becomes a lot more difficult to handle all the data and make sure access is happening everywhere. A lot of smaller businesses can't afford this, which means that either they'll be pushed out of the market altogether, or smaller businesses will be de-incentivized to join the market in the first place, which hurts the economy because small businesses are the backbone of a lot of technology and are the backbone of businesses and the economy in general. So if they falter, then the economy falters. It's just like a pretty clean connection between the two. So for all these reasons, tech companies or the technology sector in general would be ruined, which spills over to the economy because, as we've established, technology is a huge part of the economy. US economy failure means that this leads to a global recession because everyone in the world is interconnected. And yeah, that'd be pretty bad. Poverty is an impact, but also global recession is a large prereq to a lot of different arguments or short circuit. For example, because a lot of these arguments are perceptual, the argument happens almost immediately. So you're going to win time frame. And if you're winning time frame, then you control the rest of the impact. So for example, war gets worse if the economy happens, or if we're focused on the economy, we can't start a war. So you can either short circuit or link in. Second of all, like climate change gets worse without the economy because we're focused on that thing. Like there's just so many ways that you can link into other impacts with the economy. It's a really good short circuit, and the time frame on it is just really, really great. Okay, these are all of our arguments for the Nocember topic. We hope you enjoyed this topic lecture, and let us know if you have any questions. Feel free to reach out to us on the debate hotline Instagram or our website. Thank you so much for watching.